The assumption that government spending is synonymous with governance has become one of the most durable ideas in modern American liberal politics. Over time, the size of a budget has increasingly been treated as a proxy for seriousness, compassion, and administrative competence. In California, this assumption hardened into orthodoxy as voters, activists, and political elites came to equate expanded public investment with moral commitment and problem-solving capacity. Under this framework, the question was rarely whether the state should spend more, but only how much more and how quickly. This logic did not emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by decades of underinvestment at the federal level, growing inequality, housing shortages, and visible social distress. When Gavin Newsom assumed office, he inherited a political environment where expectations were already set. Bold leadership meant large budgets, ambitious programs, and a willingness to deploy the state's fiscal power at scale. California's economic size reinforced this mindset. As the world's fifth largest economy by GDP, the state appeared uniquely positioned to prove that progressive governance could succeed through financial muscle alone. Yet embedded in this assumption was a subtle but consequential misjudgment. Spending is an input, not an outcome. Money can expand capacity, but it does not automatically produce coordination, efficiency, or results. Treating expenditure itself as governance risks collapses the distinction between intent and execution. It also shifts political accountability away from outcomes and toward appropriation, where success is measured by dollars allocated rather than conditions improved. Over time, this mindset reshaped policy debates. Structural reform, regulatory simplification, and institutional redesign became secondary to budget negotiations. Programs multiplied, agencies expanded, and appropriations grew, often without corresponding mechanisms to measure effectiveness or enforce consequences for failure. The political system rewarded visible spending more than invisible competence and urgency more than durability. The lesson embedded in this first assumption is not that public spending is inherently misguided. Rather, it is that spending, when elevated from a tool to an ideology, can obscure the harder work of governance. When money becomes the primary language of leadership, the state risks mistaking motion for progress and scale for success, setting the stage for disappointment when reality refuses to conform to the balance sheet. California's fiscal expansion under my administration was not subtle, accidental, or hidden behind accounting tricks. It was explicit, deliberate, and publicly defended as necessary governance in an era defined by crisis. When I took office in 2019, the state budget stood at a little over $200 billion. Within a few years, it had grown past $300 billion, driven by pandemic response, expanded social programs, housing initiatives, healthcare coverage, climate policy, and historic investments in education and infrastructure. This was not incremental government, it was scale. The justification at the time was straightforward. California entered the COVID era with budget surpluses, a progressive tax structure capturing capital gains during a technology boom, and constitutional reserve mechanisms designed after the Great Recession to prevent collapse. The state deployed stimulus, expanded Medi-Cal, funded emergency rental assistance, issued direct payments, and backstopped local governments. From inside the executive branch, this felt less like ideological excess and more like triage. The demand for action was immediate, and the political system rewarded speed over restraint. Yet fiscal expansion did not stop with the emergency phase. Even as federal relief tapered and revenue volatility became clearer, baseline spending remained elevated. New programs were layered atop temporary ones. Commitments made during surplus years hardened into expectations during leaner cycles. By 2023, California faced multi-year deficits measured in the tens of billions, requiring withdrawals from reserves, delayed spending, and accounting maneuvers that stood in quiet tension with earlier claims of sustainability. What this period revealed was not fiscal recklessness in the caricatured sense, but institutional momentum. Once the government expands, contraction becomes politically radioactive. Every program acquires a constituency. Every dollar removed is framed as harm rather than recalibration. The budget becomes less a strategic document and more a map of accumulated promises, many only loosely connected to measurable outcomes. From the governor's chair, the paradox was clear. We spent more than any prior administration in absolute terms, yet public frustration intensified rather than eased. The sheer size of the budget ceased to impress because lived experience did not scale with appropriations. The expansion proved that capacity without discipline does not guarantee results, and that fiscal magnitude by itself is not synonymous with effective governance. The most uncomfortable test of any governing philosophy is not what it intends, but what it produces. By that measure, the years of elevated investment exposed a widening gap between expenditure and outcome across several of California's most visible challenges. Housing was the clearest example. Despite unprecedented funding for affordable housing, homelessness programs, and local incentives, the cost of shelter continued to rise faster than wages, and unsheltered homelessness remained entrenched in many of our largest cities. The public saw cranes in the air and budgets on paper, yet the lived reality on sidewalks and rent statements barely shifted. Public safety told a similar story. Significant resources flowed into prevention programs, reentry services, and local government support, yet perceptions of disorder and insecurity intensified. Data showed mixed results depending on the category and year, but perception became political reality. When residents feel less safe, they do not parse budget line items. They judge outcomes. Spending that fails to register in daily life loses legitimacy, no matter how well-intentioned. Infrastructure investment, long delayed, finally surged, but projects moved slowly, constrained by permitting, litigation, and fragmented authority. Roads, transit lines, and water systems absorbed billions, while timelines stretched across decades. To the public, the state appeared simultaneously flush with cash and incapable of delivery. The contradiction eroded confidence not just in specific programs, but in the competence of government itself. Even in areas of genuine progress, such as expanded healthcare coverage or climate commitments, the benefits are often felt abstract or distant compared to immediate pressures like the cost of living. Californians did not doubt that money was being spent. They doubted that it was working. The core failure was not indifference or corruption. It was a misalignment between scale and systems. We funded programs faster than we reformed the institutions responsible for executing them. We measured effort in dollars rather than outcomes in time, cost, and human experience. As a result, investment became decoupled from improvement. This is where the limits of spending as governance became undeniable. Money amplified existing structures, but it did not correct their flaws. And when outcomes fail to track investment, the public draws a simple conclusion. Government is trying harder, but governing no better. The failure of outcomes to match investment forced a reckoning with a truth that is easy to ignore from a distance, but impossible to escape from inside government. Institutions matter more than appropriations. California does not suffer from a lack of ambition. It suffers from a dense web of procedural friction that turns urgency into delay and intention into attrition. Every major policy objective must pass through layers of review, regulation, local discretion, litigation risk, and administrative caution, each rational in isolation but collectively paralyzing. Environmental review, labor standards, zoning authority, and local control are not flaws in themselves. They are the accumulated product of past reforms, each designed to correct a genuine abuse or failure. But over time, these protections hardened into veto points. Housing projects funded by the state stalled for years over compliance disputes. Infrastructure initiatives slowed under the weight of overlapping approvals. Even emergency actions faced constraints that blurred the line between oversight and obstruction. The system is optimized for the prevention of error, not speed of delivery. From the governor's office, this created a structural paradox. The public demanded faster results, yet the legal and administrative architecture rewarded caution, delay, and risk aversion. Agencies learned that it was safer to move slowly than to fail publicly. Local governments, empowered by state law, could accept funds without fully aligning with state priorities. Accountability diffused across jurisdictions until no single actor could be held responsible for missed targets. Spending more money on this environment did not overcome friction. It magnified it. Larger budgets meant more contracts, more compliance, more oversight, and more opportunities for delay. Instead of buying efficiency, funding often subsidized complexity. The system absorbed resources without changing behavior. This is the point where the myth of executive control collapses. Governors do not command institutions, they negotiate with them. Authority is fragmented by design, and reform requires political capital that spending alone cannot substitute. Without structural change, investment becomes an accelerant poured onto an engine that was never redesigned to handle the load. The lesson is not that constraints should be abandoned, but that governance demands prioritization. A system built to block mistakes will also block progress. Until institutions are rebalanced to value delivery alongside protection, no level of spending will consistently translate into results. Misallocation is rarely the product of bad faith. In California, it emerged from a political economy that rewards process compliance, stakeholder appeasement, and risk diffusion more than outcomes. Once large sums are authorized, the real contest begins over who administers them, who qualifies, and under what conditions. Each decision is shaped by lobbying, legal exposure, and institutional habit. The result is not theft or scandal, but dilution. Funds intended for public benefit are filtered through administrative layers that absorb time and money before reaching their targets. Programs designed to serve vulnerable populations accumulate eligibility rules, reporting requirements, and contracting intermediaries that narrow access and slow delivery. Nonprofits and consultants proliferate, each necessary within the system, yet collectively consuming a growing share of resources. The public sees the headline number, but the lived benefit arrives smaller, later, and unevenly. Political incentives reinforce this pattern. Legislators favor programs that can be geographically distributed and symbolically branded. Agencies favor initiatives that minimize legal risk and maximize procedural defensibility. Local governments accept state funds while preserving autonomy, sometimes resisting reforms that would impose accountability in exchange for flexibility. No actor is irrational. Each responds to incentives as they exist, but the aggregate outcome is spending that prioritizes stability over effectiveness. This dynamic also reshapes priorities. Long-term reforms that threaten entrenched interests face resistance, while short-term funding expansions encounter applause. Budgets grow faster than performance metrics mature. Evaluation becomes an afterthought, often conducted by the same institutions that benefit from continuation. Sunsetting programs proves harder than creating them, even when evidence of impact is weak or inconclusive. From inside the executive branch, the frustration is structural. Redirecting funds requires political confrontation. Tightening standards invites accusations of cruelty or austerity. Yet allowing misallocation to persist corrodes public trust just as surely. Over time, citizens conclude that government spending serves systems more reliably than people, and that reform is promised more often than delivered. The political economy of misallocation teaches a sobering lesson. Spending does not fail because the government lacks compassion. It fails because institutions respond to incentives, not intentions. Without redesigning those incentives towards speed, accountability, and measurable outcomes, additional funding merely deepens the pattern. Money follows power, and power, left unchecked, follows comfort. Public trust does not erode all at once. It thins gradually through a series of small disappointments that accumulate into a larger doubt about competence and credibility. In California, the backlash was not primarily ideological. It was experiential. Residents did not revolt against the idea of public investment. They questioned why unprecedented spending coincided with a rising cost of living, visible disorder, and a sense that daily life was becoming harder rather than more secure. Perception mattered as much as data. Even where metrics showed marginal improvement or long-term promise, they struggled to compete with immediate realities. Rent increases, lengthy commutes, unresolved encampments, and bureaucratic encounters that felt opaque and unresponsive. The government spoke in aggregates and projections. People lived in specifics. That disconnect proved politically corrosive. Migration patterns became a symbol of this loss of confidence. When households leave, They rarely cite budget allocations. They cite affordability, safety, schools, and opportunity. The narrative that took hold was simple and damaging. California spent more than any state in the nation, yet failed to deliver a commensurate quality of life. Once that story settled into public consciousness, it began to override nuance, turning complexity into indictment. Electoral behavior reflected this shift. Ballot measures promising reform gained traction. Prosecutors, mayors, and legislators faced recall efforts and backlash campaigns. Even when incumbents survived, the margins narrowed and the tone hardened. Voters did not demand radical retrenchment, but they signaled impatience with a governing model that equated effort with expenditure. From within government, the warning signs were unmistakable. Trust is a finite resource. When people believe that money disappears into systems without a visible return, cynicism fills the vacuum. Good faith initiatives are reinterpreted as waste. Necessary investments are viewed with suspicion. The political space for long-term reform shrinks as demands for immediate correction intensify. The backlash was not a rejection of liberal governance itself. It was a rejection of a version of it that appeared insulated from feedback. When outcomes lag and explanations multiply, legitimacy erodes. And once trust is lost, even well-designed policies struggle to regain traction, regardless of how much funding accompanies them. The final lesson is the hardest one, for a system built on good intentions and expansive capacity to accept. Governance is not measured by how much money is spent, but by what changes as a result. The checkbook is a tool, not a strategy. When it becomes a strategy, it crowds out the quieter, more difficult work of institutional reform, enforcement, and prioritization. What California's experience demonstrates is not that government should retreat from responsibility, but the responsibility requires discipline. Effective governance depends on aligning authority with accountability, simplifying pathways from decision to delivery, and being willing to say no to programs that underperform, to processes that stall progress, and to interests that benefit from inertia. None of those choices is solved with larger appropriations. In fact, larger budgets often delay them. From the governor's chair, this reality is sobering. Power in American federalism is fragmented by design. Governors operate within legal, fiscal, and political constraints that money cannot dissolve. Without reforming how institutions behave, spending simply reinforces existing patterns. It makes failure more expensive, not less likely. The deeper correction lies in redefining success. It means shifting political incentives away from announcements and toward outcomes. It means rewarding speed, competence, and follow-through as much as compassion. It means treating evaluation as governance, not as an after-action report designed to justify continuation. Most importantly, it means accepting that restraint can be a form of leadership, not a betrayal of values. More government spending is not inherently wrong. In moments of crisis, it is indispensable. But as a default governing philosophy, it is insufficient. California's challenge, and the challenge of modern liberal governance more broadly, is to prove that the state can not only mobilize resources, but steward them effectively. The lesson beyond the checkbook is this: legitimacy is earned through results. When government delivers, trust follows. When it does not, no surplus, no appropriation, and no rhetorical commitment can substitute. The future of liberal governance will be decided not by how much it spends, but by how well it governs within the limits of reality.